Got it? All right. Well, I'm Gil Ontai. I'm the chair of the subcommittee for outreach, and I have my fellow subcommittee commissioners, Commissioner Pervenu, Commissioner Aguirre, and Commissioner Raya. We also have some other commissioners here who are on the different subcommittees. We have Commissioner DiGilio, Commissioner Yao, and Commissioner Baraba. Okay, I think what I want to do is first of all state that this committee's purpose is to define a model for which we would go out to the public and do outreach programs. And we have been working very hard as a subcommittee to put that together. And we have what we want to discuss today are some suggestions on how we're going to do that. Now, two of our subcommittee members are not privy to some of the discussions that Commissioner Aguirre and I have had with two consultants in the last week or so. So I'm going to kind of try to bring you up to speed and just open it up to questions as we go along. So the first thing that I have on our agenda is the meeting framework. So what you have in front of you is a draft schedule which we had worked out with CCP. And do you have that? So what we have here are a list of dates set aside for workshops, educational workshops, and public input hearings. Now, I should say that in the process of doing this, we had to come at some consensus as to what we're going to call these meetings. So when you see these charts, you'll see educational workshops, and they're intended to be precisely that. It's an effort to reach out to community groups and to educate the public about what redistricting is all about, to gather interest, to be involved and to participate. And it's not about mapping. It's about getting the public involved in that process. And the attempt here is to reach out to all citizens of California. On the other hand, public input hearings are set aside for public testimony for the purpose of defining maps. So when we have these hearings, we need to have at that point a mapper, possibly other consultants who would be part of that process of gathering that information from the public and packaging it in ways and in forms that this commission ultimately can codify and make some sense out of it. So I wanted to make that distinction between these two types of public outreach. One is an educational workshop, which we have developed with CCP, that's the Center for Collaborative Policy, and the other is input hearings for the purpose of collecting public testimony on mapping. And that will be with a consulting firm that we are in the process of putting a request for proposal. So we'll soon identify who that consultant will be. Now, simultaneously, there is actually another form of public outreach that is going on, and this was discussed this morning at the Communications Subcommittee. And that is our Communications Director, Rob Wilcox, is setting up a schedule in which individual commissioners will be reaching out in their respective communities, regions, possibly throughout the state. But this is primarily focused at media outreach. So some of us may be requested to do public appearances. Could be a guest at a public event or forum. It could be a speaker at a TV program. It could be before an editorial board. So some of us will have to make that commitment. And I know some of us have been doing that already. So there are three types of public outreach that I wanted to make very clear that this commission is doing and is proposing to do. So we have, again, the educational workshops, which we will commence immediately starting this Saturday with our first educational workshop here at the Capitol. Then very shortly, within a month, we will begin the public input hearings to gather public testimony on mapping information that will take the form of defining what are communities of interest, what are neighborhood boundaries, what are community boundaries, and to do that in a fashion in which we can codify that and make sense out of it. And then simultaneously, while all this is going on, we will still have media outreach, which is done individually by each of these commissioners. So what I want to do next is draw your attention to the schedule that I just handed out. So if you look at March, you'll see that March 12, 19, and 26, 23rd, 27, and 30 are set aside as educational workshops. We took the various regions based on the recommended proposal for outreach on a regional basis given to us by statewide database Karen McDonald. So if you recall that map that she gave us, this is where those locations come from. So we tried to distribute these educational workshops in a broad area covering all of the state of California. So if you go on to the next sheet, which is April, you'll see that the public input hearing begin. So we have April 2nd, April 9, April 16th, April 30th as public input hearings. They're all on Saturdays. We also have, for the month of April, continuing educational workshops, and they're shown as April 3rd, April 6th, April 10th, and that's it. You'll notice we plugged in all the holidays which we felt were important for us to recognize and try to avoid those holidays. These are both national holidays, state holidays, and community holidays. So if you flip that over, we have the month of May. And again, we continue with designated specific dates. We have May 4th as an input hearing, May 7th, May 14th, May 21st, May 15th, and May 22nd as input hearings. Please note that on May 25th, we are suggesting that this commission submit its first initial maps. And the reason for that is because of the tremendous compactness in time in which we have to meet the August 15th date. We felt that this would be a reasonable target date for us to release the Commission's first trial map. And it is, we felt, very important for the public to know that, so that they can schedule their anticipation and energies behind that very targeted and special date. So if you turn to the next page, on June, we continue the public input hearings. It is June 1st, June 4th, June 5th, June 8th, June 11th, June 12th, June 18th, June 19th, June 25th, and June 26th. We anticipate that we will have an intensified public response to that initial plan. So, as you notice, all of these meetings are now set up as input meetings. Now, the Commission may choose to have additional meetings to this, but this is a first draft suggested schedule on how we can meet that response once we release that trial map or maps. If you turn that over to July, you notice that July is absolutely open. And that's because we felt that at that point, we may have to do additional meetings, more than what we anticipated. We may have to visit different regions of the state multiple times, depending on what issues transpire from the creation of our public inputs. So we left that blank for the Commission to look at, and probably because we need to base that decision on the response back from the communities and the consultants that we hire and their recommendations. So in a broad scope, this is what the subcommittee is requesting that we submit to the full Commission. If you turn to the last page, you will see a sample detailed outline of what typically would happen in a community educational workshop. This is the format being proposed by CCP. Commissioner Aguirre and I have met with them, have gone over this carefully. We think it's a reasonable, detailed summary of what would actually happen. And so if my subcommittee members could review that, this will give you a very clear sense, or more detailed sense, of what the actual format would look like.
And Commissioner Ontai, this is just for the workshop? This is an example of the workshop meeting, not
That's
the input
correct.
hearing. Okay.
Yeah, we don't have one for the community input hearings yet, because we felt it was necessary for us to get that consultant in first and work very closely in defining what that format would look like. But clearly, the educational workshop using this format appears to be reasonable.
And are all the workshops slated for the evening times?
Yes. As you can see, they all start at actually 5.
May I interject? I'm here saying no in some cases. I suppose this is an example then?
This, the schedule, as you see in the table that was presented, shows an evening format, but actually it just shows a range of hours for this particular workshop if it were implemented in the evening. However, that same model could be backed up to the early morning or the afternoon, and it would just follow that kind of sequence of activities. But, so.
Okay.
I was just curious as to whether or not they were all scheduled at this point for evenings, or if you had the flexibility.
Yeah, I apologize. It would occur during the day as well as during the evening.
And this applies for all Saturdays as well as the option to have these during evenings from 5 to 9.
Now, bear in mind, this is a tentative, suggested first shot at the scheduling, but we felt, Aguirre and I hope my colleagues feel the same way, that we needed to pin down some dates and get this out to the public as soon as possible, because the public needs to have enough time to prepare and to plan and to set some sense of rhythm as to how the Commission is operating.
So I might add that, clarifying for the public who may be watching, that we have the educational workshops that are scheduled to begin on March the 12th and run through April the 10th. There's 9 of those. Then we have the public input hearings, which are the pre-mapping hearings that begin on April the 2nd and go through March the 22nd. And then we have the other set of input hearings, which are post-mapping, since we set a target date of developing and having ready the initial draft maps by May the 26th, then the actual post-map sessions occur after that, starting on June the 1st, and they run through June the 26th. So it's just about every Saturday, and so there's 10 of those. And then after that, we thought, well, what happens in July? And the discussion was that depending on the response from the public regarding the sessions in June, which are the post-map, where we take the maps to get some feedback, depending on what kind of questions and responses we get from that, then we left July totally open for us to schedule those sessions throughout the state, depending on where the need was greatest. So.
I think this is a great tool, and it's a wonderful starting point. I think this really nails down some things that we need to move forward with. I'd just be curious to hear a little bit about the methodology that you went through in determining. I see a little bit here. It sounds like you chose a Southern California and a Northern California in determining the workshops, and how you came to choose. I'm particularly curious, like a Saturday and Sunday. I'm wondering if the issue ever on Sundays ever came up in terms of some communities maybe not being able to participate as much for religious reasons, or that Sundays tend to be full with some other activities. Or so I guess I was curious as to the methodology behind how you did this. I think it would be very helpful. You alluded to it, and it would be great to hear those details. And then maybe also just kind of how you've come to put them in the format that you have.
Yeah, so maybe if I can have Sarah Rubin come up. Sarah is with CCP, Sarah and her colleague Charlotte. So if you can come, please. And we worked this together at a workshop at our office last Friday.
Right.
And, well, we worked most of the dates out. Gavino and I had to leave because we had an airplane flight, and we left the rest up to her.
In response to your question, Commissioner DiGiulio, about Sundays, there has been some consideration that has been given to that, and that's why this is a draft form. And the dates, that's why we're bringing it to the rest of the committee to see whether these dates work for our purposes, the purposes of the commission. And so they're not set in stone. So if there is an interest, which I think there is, to do some Sunday work, that would be for us to.
I'm sure CCP is an expert, so they have some methodology behind it in your decisions. So I just would love to hear some of that background a little bit. Sure. So thank you.
Just a question before the presentation starts. You have a little bit of overlap between the workshop and the first set of input hearings. We talk about phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Are there overlaps between phase 1 and phase 2 input meetings, and also beyond that?
Yeah, Commissioner Yao, the educational workshops in reality can continue throughout the whole summer, because it essentially is reaching out to the public and letting them become aware of what redistricting is all about. And I think it's reasonable to assume that we have some folks that are very knowledgeable at this point, but they will be latecomers. Especially when we release our first trial map, then I think there are probably a good number of people will say, I want to know more about what this thing is all about. So while we ended it in April, the educational workshops, we feel there's going to be some overlapping at the time we start talking about the release of the census tract data and having input meetings. We're still going to have some need to educate the public about what this is all about.
I might add to that the education continues at every input session and as a pre-hearing. So in other words, if the meeting is starting at 6 o'clock, then CCP will be available before that time to not only help set up the environment for the hearing itself, but will be available for other individuals who would be interested in providing information to the Commission with some guidance from CCP to work with them, educating them about the types of information that that the Commission is looking for, maybe coaching them in terms of what kind of language to use or what kind of maps would be most acceptable, et cetera, et cetera. Perhaps CCP could talk about that aspect as well. So.
And just let me add on to that last note. I know a number of us have made educational presentations to groups back in our own regions. The last one that I made, it became very clear to me that there are grassroots folks that simply don't have a clue as to what redistricting is all about. So I think we're going to have a good number of citizens that are going to be in that position throughout the whole summer.
And before our distinguished guests speak, I just have one brief comment on the schedule. First of all, it's an excellent framework. I really appreciate this. This is really focusing in on what we have to do with a clear timeline. With the workshops in the Los Angeles area, I was informed by the mayor's office, I work for City Hall, that we can use the City of LA's facilities, meaning the downtown Civic Center complex, the LAPD's auditorium, as well as the Van Nuys satellite office to hold our meetings, so at either very low or no cost. So for the local commissioners, Commissioner Raya and Blanca, they may want to assist me in setting that up. I'll take the initiative on that if that's a agreed upon place. And secondly, with the North meetings, we mentioned, I know it's arbitrary, we mentioned Reading or Coast or Eureka. I would simply like to add Chico there, because there's a state college there that we may want to consider, Chico State. So that's another option for those northern regions.
University. State University.
State University, right, that's right. I stand corrected. That's even more in agreement with our efforts.
Okay, so, Ms. Rubin, so if you could give us a little spiel here.
Sure. Hi, good afternoon. Hello, commissioners. Hi, Dan. Hi, Janice. We're so happy to be back at the subcommittee, and we have a proposal for you that we are hoping we can really go through in detail, dig in, have a discussion, have you answer any questions you have as far as the methodology, and then talk through what you would like to see us present on Friday to the full commission. So here we've got narrative, details about the components, and then we also have budget numbers. So we want to take you through everything, including the assumptions around the budget numbers. But if you want, we can start with the calendar, or we can start from the beginning. What would you prefer?
Well, let's start off with the first question. How did you arrive at the dates?
Okay. So, want me to start? Want to say hello?
Hi, Charlotte Shorner with the Center for Collaborative Policy.
Okay. So we wanted to start, the methodology is we wanted to start as soon as possible. And the soonest we felt like we could realistically do anything, and it's going to be pushing it, is March 12th. Because you have to realize that besides getting the location, you need to still create all of your materials. You need to have your legal counsel review your materials. Then we need to have time to get all your materials translated and printed, and March 12th is very soon. So it's a tall order. So that was one way that we started. Then, if you're looking at March, we really think about our first workshop as a trial run or a pilot. So we wanted to give ourselves a week between the first and the second to tweak or adjust the model, improve it, given whatever feedback we get. And then we do the same thing in the South. We have the first workshop in the South. We see how that goes. And then as we get to what we have here is the 23rd of March, Central Valley, that's when we really ramp up the schedule. And then for any workshops we have listed during the week, we have Wednesday as a placeholder, but what we're thinking is depending on the area and the sites we're looking at and what's going on in the community, we'll likely have that event on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. So we want to leave it open. We just set it in the middle of the calendar for planning purposes. Okay, moving to April. If you want to have 10 meetings, 10 input hearings before your maps come out, you have to start your input hearings in April. So there's, unless you're going to do multiple hearings on weeknights, you pretty much have to use all of your Saturdays and Sundays. So that's why we have the input hearings starting April 2nd. And one thing we thought about with the dates for the input hearings is we wanted to leave at least 3 weeks between an educational workshop and a hearing, because we're asking folks who come to those educational workshops to go home, to involve their neighbors, their friends, to get more people involved and to prepare, and that takes time. So there's at least 3 weeks between the regions. Go ahead.
Would you entertain questions in between?
Of course.
The sites for the workshops and the sites for the input meeting in that same region, how close together are they?
Well, my understanding is that the commission's really interested in moving around. So say, for example, you go the first time to Fresno, maybe the second time you go to somewhere more like Bakersfield, versus going back to Fresno, so that you're reaching out to a different piece of these very large geographic areas.
Distance between Fresno and...
Well, I think these regions are, if we call those maps, the regions that we're talking about are very large areas. So as much as we'd like to come back to that same spot, I think to do due diligence to trying to reach all those spots, it may be, if you pick something like Fresno in the Central Valley, it's within 3 hours or so from the north to the south, and then you could just move out from there, a little in the south, a little in the north. It looks like they have at least 2 more additional input hearings. So I would imagine
And
that's
that
probably
was the
similar with
logic
the others.
behind it.
Yeah.
And before we move off the workshops in this draft, we added a section about conference call webinars. So we're proposing, let's see, where is it? It's kind of jumping around, but I want to highlight it here. It's on page 8. And we'll get, and the idea here is that you would hold 2 remote educational workshops via conference call and webinar, so people would call in on the phone to get audio and could follow along visually with the presentation online. So I just wanted to point this out here because this is something that you could do in addition to your in-person workshops to capture a lot of other folks too.
So would CCP then, let's say there's going to be a webinar for, in addition to one in the, you've had a educational workshop in the Central Valley, then you would like to have a educational webinar. Would CCP be responsible for then contacting the different communities within the Central Valley and saying, on this date, we're going to have an educational webinar, and securing the facilities so that individuals could go to those? I'm assuming in order for them to see what's going on, do they just have to have access to a computer, or do they have to be accessing?
Yeah, to participate in the webinar, so they could call in and not see the actual handouts online real time. The webinar adds that function. And the idea here is that you don't have to make them place-based. They can just be overarching. So someone in Fresno missed the in-person workshop. They could call in to this type of venue, at least get the information, someone in Bakersfield and the workshop was in Fresno and that was just too far. But they could at least call in and get the information, and then when the hearing comes to Bakersfield, it's a way to fill in some gaps.
But the idea with the webinars and conference calls is it could be anyone. You could be in Needles, you could be in Eureka, you could be in Fresno, but you might not be able to travel.
They just have to have access to a telephone at the least.
You have to have a telephone. Yeah.
And also webinars provide an opportunity for some of our partners out throughout California to really organize sessions that link with that webinar where they themselves can use that as a training tool and an educational tool. So.
And this is just for the educational aspect. You don't do a webinar for the inputs. This is
just the
right.
hearing.
Okay.
Yeah. That was my only.
Okay, so that's the idea behind the list of workshops finishing up in mid-April, and then the input hearings starting at the top of April, running through May. And then once we go into June, you see we try to do 10 more input meetings after the maps have come out. And then as Commissioner Antai already explained, the concept is once your maps come out, you see where you need to have additional meetings. That helps you to refine the locations that would be most helpful to have those meetings. So at the beginning of June, you set your schedule for the rest of July. And for budgeting purposes, we're assuming 10 more hearings in July. So the calendar would look the same as far as words. It's just going to be different locations.
Can you comment on your preference of weekend versus weekdays?
Yeah, one of the things we've talked to folks about is one big issue is traffic. So depending on where you live, it can be a real challenge to get anything at 6 p.m. because of the traffic patterns. And when we are talking about these very large geographic areas, so for example, if you're in the LA area, you know how LA traffic is. It could be basically you couldn't get there until it was over. So that's one reason we thought we needed to hold some of these meetings on the weekends. Now for Sundays, Sunday came up early. The time that we all had been talking about for Sunday was 1 to 4 or 1 to 5.
Yeah, it's for actually both Saturday and Sunday. Our recommendation was to do it 1 to 4 in the afternoon. You miss a little bit of kind of
soccer and sports on Saturday mornings, and then for those who go to some kind of religious activity on Sunday.
Any other questions? As part of this process, we are let's look at your format, Sarah.
Sure.
Let's turn to your format.
The workshop?
The workshop.
Yeah.
Now, what we haven't yet cleared in our minds.
What page are you on? I'm sorry, Gil.
I'm on this
7.
last sheet.
The one
they're
in our
going to be
packet.
different, though.
It's different.
So
We've
in ours,
updated it.
Oh, you updated it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
If we
I'm
could.
assuming it's better.
It's very similar, but it's a little easier to follow. I think he has it, right? It's on page 7 of the one we just passed out.
All right. What has come up this morning on a number of subcommittee meetings is how are we going to fit into this format, this educational workshop format? Some degree of instructions on how to do mapping. Where would that take place? This is not actual mapping, but the technology and how to do it, and how does that work?
Where we have that now is in the fourth column titled Education regarding substance. So just to reiterate, we're there an hour before it starts. We're welcoming people as they arrive. We have multilingual signage up. We have a number of different ways that we can be capturing information from folks who come in, because we want to be able to get a hold of them again in the future so they can keep providing their input to the commission. We want to have laptops for people who prefer to enter that way, or if they prefer to write out their contact information. We're also going to be asking folks if they know of any groups that the commission should add to their mailing list. And then we will have different tables in the room with materials so that if they're early, they can begin to self-educate or to be looking around at the different visuals. And we start the session. The commissioners provide opening remarks. In this version, we're assuming something like 1 to 3 commissioners are attending the workshops. Then CCP does the overall facilitation. We explain what will be happening during the session. And then we move into an education piece about the process that the commission is engaging in with the public. So, how you're participating with the public, your calendar, when workshops will be held, a lot of the things we're looking at today, and then an initial overview of the resources that are available to people. How can they participate? What are all the different ways they can do that? And then explaining the toolkit we've all been talking about with materials, the 6 assistance centers, taking some questions that people naturally will have, and then we move into the heart of the workshop, which we would be provided by one of your technical trainers. And that's when you get into the specifics. the criteria that you have to keep in mind as you draw maps. And that's when your mapping tools would be demonstrated. And you'd also have a resource handout about free or low-cost mapping tools if people want to go back home.
And then in the next section here at 8:25, the work session, we had pictured having some tables with information on them, stations, if you will, and one would be a mapping station. You could have actual hard maps where people could draw on, and then they could be digitized. And we could also have the mapper there, if there is one, with the demoing it for a small group that was, if that's what they were most interested in doing, then we could accommodate some demos, small groups.
So the overall concept is for people who don't have that much time, you give them the heart of the information. If they want to exit, then they head out a little after 8 p.m. But for those people who are willing, or in this evening example, but for those who are willing or interested to stay and do a little more work and really look at some maps and network and talk with people, then we provide that opportunity for them to really dig in.
Okay, so I want to make sure it's very clear that at the end of this format, people that have never done this before will have some idea of what it takes to do a map. Not actual maps to us, but the steps and the procedure on how to draw maps and what to look at. Right?
For them to draw their own map to submit?
Yeah.
Yes.
We're going to teach them the tools.
Yes.
And to make them familiar with the tools and how to draw maps.
Exactly. I think the distinction is just that it'll be a high-level overview for like a full redistricting map that your technical consultant would be putting together. That would just be sort of high-level explained. But for them to do their own maps of communities, that is definitely what we'd be covering here, and providing those tools.
I guess I just want to clarify that just you can be explaining it to people and even be participating in a demo, but I know myself when you go back home and you think, oh, that looked easy, let me try it myself. I don't think we can guarantee that everyone can make their own map. It's, you think it seems easy and then you get home and
we can provide the tools, the guidance, the resources, where to get help. These resource assistance centers that Karen's been speaking about do have staff that you can actually call up and get some assistance over the phone.
Right.
So we'll be at least making sure that people walk away knowing all of those resources are available to
Commissioner
them.
Waya?
Yeah, I have a question. We're looking for a specific kind of input from the public.
right.
So my question is, how much direction are they going to get, for example, to draw this sample map, to tell us, is it going to be, draw around the neighborhoods that you think should be part of it, or some kind of a sense of how you're going to use that to tell us about your community of interest?
Right. Well, what I would say is that there's the specific community of interest definition, and I think we can assume for many people who will be providing you all with public testimony, they're going to be talking about their own community of interest. So you want to have your resources in your toolkit really explain, and that's on our list of the kinds of handouts you'd have, is what is a community of interest, and then you have a specific worksheet where you literally kind of walk people through specific questions that help them think through what does that mean, and then it's up to the individual. If they want to get out a AAA map and they want to draw where they think the boundary of their community of interest is, that's up to them. If they want to use an online mapping tool, that's up to them. But the kind of thing we've talked about is, depending on where we go, trying to have some AAA maps that are just there in case someone wants to get it out and get into the nitty-gritty. That would be up to them.
I would just add that the idea behind providing that toolkit at each workshop would have really specific outline of how. So if the mapper decides that it's going to be done by roads, like it has to be along a road, like that would be one thing that we would highlight and go through all together in a workshop, providing that
Yes,
specifics.
that's the kind of thing. We want you to introduce the concepts
Yes.
and the semantics, the terminology of what this is all about, because there's a great number of citizens out there that this is a whole new lexicon.
Right. Exactly. And the kind of detail we're thinking will be helpful is when your technical consultant, when they know, for example, as they take testimony, say they want certain parameters initially for their indexing of data, when we know what those are, say it's helpful to them to have X, then Y, then Z as far as the sequencing of the information, then you can make your worksheet follow that format. So it's as easy as possible for the person who's gathering the data, who's going to be indexing it and rolling it up.
Good. Any questions? Does that give all of us a clear picture of what they're doing? Or somewhat a clear picture?
For the educational workshops.
For the educational workshops.
If we could maybe just take a step back and just do a walk through this. Sure.
I do have one comment. You know, it seemed to me that the educational workshop on the 12th here in Sacramento, which is, you're looking at sort of a pilot, I think we should have every commissioner here to see what it's like to sit in the audience of one of these activities. Because that'll give us a far greater appreciation of what we're actually providing.
Yeah, Commissioner Baraba, I know in the Finance Committee, one of the items that was pulled out was, should the commissioners be at these educational workshops, can we afford it? In our meeting, we felt that it was imperative for the public to see our faces there, at least one or two. Is that still your feelings?
Absolutely.
I was just thinking in this case, Commissioner Antai, is that this will be our first and only chance to see this, and it's the first one. and my guess is after the first one, you're going to say, oops. And so if we're going to be asked to react to the changes, it might be worth being here for that first one.
Good point.
Can I add schedule-wise, fortuitously, if we continue on this week-on, week-off schedule, we will be meeting on the 10th, perhaps the 9th, 10th, and 11th here as a full, in March, anyway, the full body. So it's just a matter of us staying over that Saturday, the 12th, for the workshop, as we are doing this weekend, for example. We're meeting in the Sacramento. So it's a good fit in this case, and very
We
doable.
planned it that way.
So we're going to be here.
Could I make a couple suggestions maybe about this? Because I think this is great, and what I'd actually really like is to see it start moving forward even more. But under a couple things that might be helpful, I'd love to see if you could maybe take a closer look at, I'm looking particularly at the input hearings. I've got complete confidence that the workshops will probably, the educational workshops will go off. It'd be interesting to see on a regional approach what might work best on the Saturday. I know you have intermixed some weekdays, but I guess I'm still kind of concerned about maybe in the LA or maybe some highly densely populated places, the weekends really have to be a necessity, but I'm thinking that there might be, I'm just looking at in the kind of a Central Valley area. I know that the Sundays often are really booked up with family, and it's because some of the events that I've done in terms of organizing my community, it's been Sundays have been a no-touch day because of the lack of participation. That might not be the case in some other areas. So I'd be curious to see if CCP or the Outreach Committee has any recommendations that basically on a regional area, Saturdays, Sundays may not be issues with some communities, but others there might be. So I'd really hope we could do some research ahead of time.
Yes.
So that would be kind of the best days, or regional best days.
Yeah, I'd say that what I would recommend would be, it's always easier to react to something than to talk about it. So in a lot of ways, we put this out so we could almost just get an order and then have people react to it just the way you are. But what I would say is that in a given, just say, for example, in San Diego, May 14th, once you talk to folks who are in that area and the people who live there and who are doing community workshops all the time, they will tell you this is what works in our community. So I think having the flexibility, ideally, if when you talk to San Diego folks, as the example, they're like Thursdays are the night for us, then rather than doing a Saturday, you shoot for the, say, Thursday before. But I think you need to have some sort of order to do your organizing.
I'd love to see if you could work with what you have here and then expand on it. Now that if we say these are some good starting points, I think it would, the Outreach Committee's done a great job here with CCP, and it'd be wonderful to even see to some degree the concept of the moving around. So instead of because I see there, it looks like there's at least, correct me if I'm wrong, there's at least 2 regional meetings. You've had input hearings with at least 2 per meeting. So it might be beneficial to say input hearing North number 1, input hearing Sacramento number 1, and then, so we could see, then you might actually even say, we propose, I would love to see the committee move forward and say, we propose the first meeting to be in Reading, the second meeting to be in Chico, or something along those lines, so we could actually get nailed down even more specific, because I think our timeline is crunched up, and again, it would be great to see some of those specifics in those regions, so we could get even a better idea of where you plan on moving around.
Yes, you're absolutely right.
I have another question, please.
Yes, Commissioner Raya.
Excuse me. Well, great. It's very exciting to see something that we're going to move forward with. My question is, because some of these are coming up so quickly, how close are we to having venues pinned down for any of these? I mean, we've had suggestions. I'm sure all of us have talked with people in our local areas about venues for hearings, but
We didn't want to make any assumptions until we met with the commission this week. So if the commission decides they want to contract with CCP, to go forward in contracting with CCP to do this, then, next week we'll start looking for locations.
And so if commissioners have suggestions, as Commissioner Parvenu, my own city is also interested in hosting something, then we would speak with you directly, or somehow through our esteemed organizers here.
So you're suggesting maybe CCP contact the commissioners from those areas to find out their level of expertise too?
Well, I guess that would be one way, or just if we already know.
That would be the way.
Yeah.
All of us contact Sarah, tell her specific places that you would recommend, and then she will compile it and get back to us.
Or it could be as simple as when we bring up the issue with the commission, then we just say, the opportunity is here for you to suggest some places in your particular region for some educational workshops or input hearings. So we're going to pass this paper around, and then we're going to fill it out so we can give it to you, because otherwise we're going to be calling, no answer, they're going to call back, we're not going to be there, so, and we need to move quickly. So to me, that would be, I think, an efficient way of doing it quickly.
And we also have to coordinate these dates and places with staffs, especially with our Director of Communications.
Do you have criterias for these meeting sites? For example, seating for 200 or whatever the case may be, 20 tables and on and on?
Yes, and we can get that, put a list together. It'd probably be helpful for anyone looking into that. It's actually, I was going to mention, if you remember the broad survey assessment that we're doing to the general public, this is one of the questions we're asking, is if the commission were to hold something in your community, could you recommend a venue that meets this long list of requirements? It's just to put it out there. If someone has something, I'm sure they'll share it as well.
In my brief inquiry with the mayor's office, the city of L.A., they were more than willing to provide a spot for us. But one technical concern on the list, the long laundry list we have, which Commissioner Yao had so successfully completed for Claremont, is the IT and the webcast capability. So I don't know if you're proposing that we maintain that particular aspect. No?
Well, that kind of brings us back, maybe we should circle around into our proposal to talk about doing a video of one educational workshop, but we are not budgeted or planning to webcast the workshops.
Okay, thank you.
So the IT would
Input hearings, are you planning on webcast or?
Yeah.
Input.
probably, yeah.
That clarifies that. For the record, I wanted to hear that again.
Commissioner Yao.
Could you maybe help me define what is success, what is failure on these workshop meetings? For example, if you get fewer than, just pick a number, 100 people, you would say that's less than expectation, or I like to hear what you think a successful event is and what less than successful event is, so kind of set my own expectation on this.
Sure, I can start. And you, I just on that one note about people or numbers of people, just always keep in mind that it depends on where you are. So if you're in, possibly in the north of the state, you'll probably have less people than you will in LA, and that's completely normal, and that's what we would expect at your.
How about the total of 9 or 10 workshops? What kind of number of people would you expect to reach?
Commissioner Yao is a number guy.
I see that. I guess I would be hesitant to put a number to it in that form. I guess we might measure our success a little bit differently than numbers or people that attend. It's more about the quality of information we're giving, the ability that they can take away and actually learn something from the materials that we're providing, have a positive interaction with the commission, be empowered to possibly do some of their own organizing or testimony, understanding the process and how they can plug in. We more concentrate on ensuring that opportunity is there and that we at least do proper outreach.
Again, I'm not necessarily saying numbers the only measure, but I would like to suggest that we have some kind of measure of success, okay, whatever that means, okay.
And I can say for the census regional meetings that I did a year ago, it was 20, kind of similar type of thing where we just, they were during the day though. Our average overall, I would say, was about 100. Some had, in San Diego, I believe we had over 300 at one meeting. And then, of course, in other areas, it was a lot smaller. So over average, I mean, about 100. But
I would like to say, though, that one of the reasons why we came to CCP was because of the extraordinary track record in the outreach you did for the census tract data process. I know in San Diego, the results of what you did there brought up a lot of folks that normally would not get involved. And that was a tremendous measurement of success. So I don't know if we can actually come up with a measuring stick on this, but we do know you have the track record to do that.
I would just add a fine point on something Charlotte said, which is, for me, when someone leaves, I want them thinking, wow, that was really worth my while. This was a really good use of my time. I'm so glad I made the choice to come, and then I'm going to tell people I know about this, and I know enough to explain it to them in a pretty articulate way. And I think to have as many people as possible thinking, wow, this commission is really doing what they said. They are really connecting with people, versus walking away thinking, should I have stayed home? That's what we're trying to avoid, that feeling.
Not to belabor the point, but from where I am sitting, I would say if this area presents a difficult restricting issue for me, okay, then I would like to get more input from that area, okay. So those are my measure of success, okay. In other words, I want more inputs from difficult areas.
Right.
And so I want to see if I can build some of those goals into your process as compared to just simply, I did the training, so many people attend, they went away happy, and leave it at that. So often we interpret success of a training is giving the training, okay? Whereas I kind of interpret the success of a training is the result of the training. And so if there's some way that we can gather up these kind of metric and measure ourselves against it along the way, I think we'll find that we have a better handle on the situation as compared to just saying, okay, we gave 10 workshops and 3,000 people came, and that's a big success, and leave it at that. So, okay, I'm going to drop it at this point.
I would just add that I think that's something within, as we go through our numbers, with our outreach numbers, that's exactly what we have in mind. That in order to get those folks who maybe are within populations that aren't normally is involved in these kinds of processes that you're trying to reach, that you're really putting in the time. And really that's what it is. It's figuring out where those organizations are, who the leaders are, connecting with those people, and then they say whoever's coming, and then double check that folks are coming. If you're providing, for example, interpreters for different segments of the community, make sure everyone knows your interpreters are going to be there. Are you definitely coming? The kind of over and over, making sure that you've got the folks out.
Yeah, I might add also that that not only are there going to be individuals from the community, but there is going to be organizing groups from the community participating in these workshops, and they're certainly going to be critical of the process. So at the end of each session, there's a plus delta evaluation where you ask for some feedback from the audience as far as what they felt about the activity itself. Was it a waste of time? What was good? What was bad? Because actually we want to, if it's necessary, modify the process and the approach from session to session so we get better and better at it as well.
And I'd like to suggest that in determining our venues that we take strong consideration of venues that are accessible to the public via public transit. We want to definitely consider that in our selections.
And ADA accessible.
One of the things that I keep thinking about is there obviously are a lot of organized groups involved or concerned and involved in this whole process, the whole subject of redistricting. And I keep wondering how we're going to get, just the person off the street, your neighbor or somebody to show up, not somebody who's necessarily being represented by a group. Because, I've talked to people who clearly have some little axe to grind, and you tell them, be sure to come to the hearings, and I'm just not sure they will, because they may not want to get up and speak, and they're not a member of some subgroup, that is represented. So I know when you did the census, I kind of look at that as maybe having a different level of interest for people. They really want to be counted, and they want to make sure their community's counted. This is, just such a different process to think about. I'm not sure how do you get that same response from just average people?
And that ties into what Commissioner Yao just asked. The more I think about it, we're a very diversified state. So when we have these educational workshops, is there some way we can measure that diversity?
I think perhaps in response to Ms. Araya's point is our executive director mentioned that that really the outreach, education, commissioners out to all the small communities process, that phase needed to be front-loaded in March, as intense as we can possibly be during March, because that's where our communications director comes in, reaching out to all the ethnic media and making sure that they're getting the message on participation, that some of us get on, all of us get on interviews, local radio talk shows to provide information on the process, inviting the public to participate. It's almost like a full court press on California to give them the information so that they have the awareness that will get them to that meeting if it's 5 miles away, if it's 20, 50 miles away. So, but given the number of workshops that we have, educational workshops, the input hearings, pre and post mapping, those are really a limited number of opportunities for us to go out there. So as to the maximum extent possible, we need to be able to go beyond those on an individual, on an immediate basis to make sure that we hit every corner of California. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I personally feel very strongly going back to the presence of commissioners. I think it's so important for the public to see, even at these educational workshops, that all of us are deeply concerned about their input. The reverse would be unfortunate.
Now, there was also a question of commissioner participation at the educational workshops. You know, at the budget committee meeting, there was, you know, some discussion about whether commissioners were going to participate in the workshops themselves or whether they weren't. Some of us are of the opinion that that we need to put a quote-unquote a commission face on every single meeting, educational workshops included. And there was mention of maybe one of us going. There's mention of maybe 3, 1, and 1 going. There's also a suggestion that if you're available and you know that there's an educational workshop, as many as possible should show up. And that just goes along with a suggestion by Karen that, you know, that the more in touch we get to the community, then the better our work is going to turn out. So. All of that to say that I would like to see us, you know, participate in this with our presence. And there's been talk about doing a video that would be shown. That's cool, but you know, it's better if, you know, one of us shows up in the flesh or a few of us show up in the flesh. That kind of dignifies the event much more than for you know, our consultants to say, well, we didn't have any commissioners available to come. You know, what a drag. Yeah, so,
How
anyway.
dignified is that?
Well, I'd say what we're looking for is at least, the way I'm thinking of it is you have your baseline, whoever is definitively coming that we can count on, at least say one, you know, in the 1 to 3. And then if others want to come, that's great. But I think from the planning point of view and helping folks with talking points and being organized and having all of our, you know, items in place so things run perfectly smooth, we just need to know who's definitively going to be coming and representing the commission so we have that on a calendar.
This tool has made tremendous progress in that area in terms of me being able to determine where I can be regionally. Prior to receiving this, I wasn't certain if I could attend all or some or be one of the 3 or what the parameters were. But after viewing this, I can tell you almost to the T which ones would be convenient for me. So I can even have a little sheet or something said, yes, I'll be there on the 12th in the Sacramento region. I'll be there, of course, I'm in Los Angeles. I'll be in the Los Angeles region one. I'll be in San Bernardino. I can just drive to that one. Sacramento on the 2nd, perhaps. West San Fernando, yes. I can pretty much discern, without belaboring the point, discern from this guideline where I can be and where I cannot be, or which would be less convenient for me. And I think that might not be unreasonable for some of the other commissioners to take a glance at this and just jot down.
We had a discussion this morning in the Public Information Committee, and we intend to report this tomorrow and remind the commissioners to update our availability calendar with even specific, you know, I'm not available from 9 to 11 on this day, so that then you can plug us into whatever, or whoever needs us to be somewhere, and that's, I mean, obviously we were looking at it also from the point of view of beginning our media outreach, that, you know, then Rob Wilcox would know our availability. So that'll work into the same thing, but I think it's really going to be incumbent on each of us to do that.
I really think that's important. I don't want to belabor the point, but I've been told personally by members in my community that if you're not there, we're not coming. So what do you say to that?
Could I ask something for the technical, the advisory committee here? I just have one suggestion, one request, and one clarification, if that's okay. So I'm sneaking in 3 things. One is, I really do like the way that's been staggered in terms of, like, you've kind of bookend a lot of I'm talking about input hearings now, bookend a lot of them in terms of general locations. If they're going to be Saturday, Sunday, they're in the general region. My only suggestion is on May 14th and 15th, the only one that's really despairing is San Diego and Bay Area. I don't know if that was intentional or that's the only one that isn't within like a close driving. Because a lot of commissioners, I think, are going to try to attempt to be at these, and you see a lot of them Central Coast, and you have kind of an Orange and an LA together, or a Central Coast and they're kind of bookend. The only exception would be San Diego and the Bay Area, which would require a lot of traveling. Does that make a sense?
I think in this scenario, we were assuming the folks who would go to San Diego would be totally different than the Bay Area, that there wouldn't be overlapping commissioners. And also, just so you know, we're putting together a number of teams to do these, so that's also why, for us, we would have a team from Southern California, just for example, doing San Diego, and a whole different set of staffers doing it. But if you think the same people are going to all of them, then...
I think there's been some discussion about the majority of commissioners... There's been some discussion to split up. There's been some discussion to keep them together. But it looks like a lot of them, like on a weekend you have L.A. and Orange, then the next weekend it's San Bernardino and San Diego. Those are kind of within the distance you could travel if you wanted to. That was the only one. That was my suggestion. The clarification. Let's see. The clarification would be. I went through and kind of did an initial 1 and 2 for input hearings. Input hearing 1, number 2. I was just trying to clarify. It looked like the first input on May 22nd, where you have Orange County and Southern LA, and then there's in June for the second one. I see there's an LA on June 18th and an Orange in June 19th. So are you looking to split those up? Partly because LA is going to be a really important one. So I assume that the May 22nd was Orange County / Southern LA, but there's not another LA for number 1 in that month, and then number 2 would be, I'm assuming the second meetings would be in June, so I see LA and Orange County being split up. So I think LA is going to be really important for us to make sure we hit. So that might be a clarification to do for the next one. And lastly, my request, for consideration, I guess, would be, I'm a visual person, and this is great, but in the end, I also like maps to see. I'm wondering if it'd be too much to ask if you had a map based on the regions to put a date into the region, like in the Sacramento region, we'd have dates, meetings on this date, and
That would also be helpful for the public.
yeah, just to know when based on your region, and the details can be worked out later. But it'd be great to visually on a map too to know where your dates are. So I don't know if that's throwing too much out there, but I think this is going to get us started and really get us running. And if the more details we have and the clarification, it would be wonderful.
I think to your point, Commissioner Julio, about a map, once we have the venues, then that would be perfect to do it that way.
Yeah. Okay.
And by the time that we get to that point, in the next couple of weeks or so, we should be ready.
We're going to first of all have to hire you, and then you can start. Okay, Commissioner Baraba.
Yes, speaking of venues, I think it says the West San Fernando Valley, and last time I checked, Van Nuys was not necessarily in the West, but you want to contact the California State University at Northridge. I'd be happy to do that. I'm a member of their board of the foundation of the community, and I know the president reasonably well. And I'm not sure they'll do it, but I'd be happy to make that contact for you.
Oh, that'd be great.
That's good.
Well, this is excellent. This is the kind of input we want. Again, this is the baseline. We can do more than this. We can adjust this. We can change the dates. We can add on dates. But we felt we had to get something going.
We're great editors, aren't we? You throw us a document, we'll edit, give you our opinion. So this is fantastic. Thank you.
Let me just add also that we really appreciate the work of CCP in developing this. This was a very high priority for the commission. Where are these dates? When are we going out? When are we going to get started? So it's really, I think, to your credit that you felt that pressure and were able to not only make yourself available to meet with us, but put something on a quick turnaround basis for this weekend. So,
Thank you.
So, Sarah, tell us something about how you're going to work with our communications director, Rob Wilcox. How do you coordinate your work with what he has to do?
Rob and I, we've just said we'll be in contact all the time. I mean, he'll be doing press releases. He'll be reaching out to all the traditional and ethnic media, micro-targeted media. I think the kinds of input we will be in close contact with him as we are doing the outreach, and we see, oh, here's we found this little pocket of community that seems to be interested, and we just found out about, say, this radio station. Maybe we can work with him. If you find out that a given community, for example, listens to a lot of, say there's a Vietnamese community that listens to radio a lot, well, the translation organization that an interpretation place that we've been talking with, they have a recording booth. So if he writes a 15-second radio spot, we can get that translated and recorded into Vietnamese, and then you can have it be, played on the radio there, just as one small example.
Yeah, and just on overarching terms, like we would work with him to review anything that we put out. Having consistent messaging is really important. So anything we've already developed, such as the flyer for Saturday's session, we drafted it and sent it to Rob, and all worked together to make sure it was consistent with everything else we've put out. And we would continue to work in that way with him.
I have a question for the advisory committee. Who is responsible for the advertisement of the event? Who do you think is responsible? All these meetings that's been scheduled here.
Well, let's talk about that. Yes. Charlotte just mentioned that you're going to coordinate your location, your workshops, wherever this is going to happen with Mr. Wilcox. And so his job will then be to take that message, that specific data, and contact the media, whether it's local minority media or the general media, on that information, so that we get as much broad general promotion as possible. That's one piece. The second piece is you have your own Rolodex that you're going to outreach with the alliances and other groups that you already have contacts that you've built up over the last 20 years. So talk about that.
Yeah, I would say it's a shared responsibility rather than naming one person that would do it. It's going to be in different ways, different touch points. So Rob would be doing your traditional media, your ethnic media, your micro-targeted local media outreach, your social networking outreach, those things that fall under his umbrella. And then we're going to be, as someone mentioned a few minutes ago, front-loading an outreach effort to build what I would call the commissioned network, say. It's where we'd be leveraging existing networks, groups that already have their own listservs. We'd want to get the person that we could connect to send it out to all those people. It's still a very big list to build those touch points, those grassroots tops. And we're building that network. So there's different points, there's different avenues to get the message out.
I hear who's going to do what work, but I did not hear who is responsible.
This is a concern that I have too, and I share. I appreciate your extensive connections, and I know you'll exercise those resources to the fullest of your capability. And perhaps I see Dan's ready to respond here. My understanding from our communications director is that we're working on a shoestring budget in terms of marketing and outreach at this particular time until we receive funds to place advertisement or announcements in some of the more traditional outreach avenues, as opposed to resorting solely on social network media outreach. Is that the case to date?
Our budget is limited, and our budget's going to be limited until we get the augmentation and the funds that we're hoping to receive. And we talked about that in the Budget Committee. Having said that, though, I think that you've touched on a very important point, and I think that we need, and Commissioner Yao as well, we need to know where the collaborative part of that's going to be with, in your title, with Rob. So perhaps this is a better way to ask, or a different way to ask this question. Who would you see taking the lead in this? Because clearly you've got to be in her.
We don't do paid advertising. It's not in our budget in any way.
No, not necessarily the paid advertisement, but the collaboration between the two of you to make sure that we're reaching. So I know that part of what you plan to do is to reach out to the individuals in the alliance, and you have, and to reach out to as many areas as you can when you go. So if you're going to Fresno, you're going to want to reach out regionally to do some of that work. Correct? So Rob, at the same time, would want to be sponsoring some of this effort, or as much of the effort as he could, so we get the maximum penetration that we can. So do you see it as being Rob kind of going down to you and saying, this is what I'm doing, and that, or how do you see making that work? Because I see a need for that kind of collaboration.
I think having a regular check-in with Rob, especially as the given workshop is going to come, we would say, okay, Reading's coming up or Chico's coming up. Rob, here is the list of organizations we've contacted so far. Here's the RSVPs we've had so far. Here are the areas that we aren't getting any response and that we're concerned about. And then he could summarize everything he's planning on doing or is doing in those areas. And then maybe where we see gaps or we aren't getting response, then you go deeper and you talk to people in that area and you say, I'm not hearing back from this community or this area. And then someone will say, oh, here's why. This is what you need to do. And then you do that. And then we could communicate back with Rob, oh, we found out there's, this kind of local newspaper there that we haven't touched yet. Can you please contact that newspaper with your press release?
I think Commissioner Yao's question is very straightforward. Where does the buck stop?
Yeah.
And
So we wouldn't do anything having to do with paid advertising.
No, I'm not worrying about the money part of it, and I clearly understand that if we ask you to advertise, we're going to have to foot that bill. But I can tell you that the reasonable turnout that we had when we had the meeting in the city of Claremont, very few of those people attend the meeting because of the website. Okay, so it's a situation where I felt responsible to get the people to the meeting, and I reached out to make sure the word get out throughout the whole Los Angeles County. So we had people that came in from the beach community 50 miles away. We had people come a long way to that meeting. So if Bob Walcott is the one that's responsible, we better make sure that, he buys into this plan, because instead of one meeting that I went through, we're talking about 30 meetings. And if he's not the one that's responsible, we better find somebody that's responsible, because getting the work done is pretty straightforward. I think you have a great plan to do it, but getting the people there is an issue that I'm not sure I'm convinced that we have that under control.
yeah,
And tying in, I just want to add quickly, and tying in with our partners as quickly as possible to let them use their extensive networks, and we'll be meeting with them on Saturday, and perhaps if we can agree upon this plan, at least they'll have a heads up to send local representatives.
When you say we, does that mean the commission is responsible?
No.
yeah. I've always understood that the reason we hired a communications director is because the buck was going to stop with him, and he's ultimately responsible. I understand the collaborative piece, not only with CCP but also with Q2 and others. But ultimately, the reason that he was hired was because his resume stated that he had extensive connections in the media, the ethnic media, that he'd done this before, several campaigns that he ran. Based on his experience and his contacts, he clearly was the one that was qualified to be there. So
Again, I don't think we need to solve the issue right here at this point in time, but I think either getting Bob convinced or Rob convinced that it's his job to make sure this happens.
Rob sat in on this work.
But did he walk away understanding that he's responsible for these 30, 40 meetings? Okay, if he can say, yes, I'm responsible, I'm going to work with CCP, I'm going to make this happen, regardless as what happens, or is he going to say, well, I'm going to put it on the website, I'm going to contact the people I have on my list, and that's all I know how to do? Okay.
I think that because he's not here, but tomorrow at tomorrow's commission meeting, that's an excellent question to bring up, because we need to be clear on that.
Yeah. It's a good question.
We expect that he is, but you want it in writing. All right. Okay.
And that's a good point. That needs to be cleared up.
I was going to mention that on page 3 of the document in front of you, we outline the communication and outreach strategy, and it just makes me wonder if we want to quickly go back and run through the full document, because we really do want your feedback on all the different components.
Absolutely.
Could you perhaps not go through the narrative, but go through each table, which is reflected in the narrative, and kind of quickly, briefly, give us what you're trying to show us?
Deliverables?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, this just to give you a little framework. We restructured a lot of the things you've seen already, the different proposals, and put them into one place and tried to make it a bit briefer. So each task is Roman numeral in bold, and then at the bottom we'll have a table with CCP deliverables we're numbering them by task.
And
So
then a
it's
corresponding dollar amount
Yeah, so
for
that's
the
it
hours.
for each section.
Yeah. So, for example, with the assessment, I'm at the bottom of page 2. So we're just going to focus on the tables and the deliverables, and then if you want to get into detail, we can, but that way we go through it quickly.
Okay.
Okay. So we've already done our informal assessment calls. We have created the assessment survey. The commission staff is currently reviewing it so it can be posted. Our task 3 is the first thing with the dollar amount, ongoing analysis of our public survey. That's where we're asking folks for feedback on how they want to be engaged, if they have suggestions for venues, et cetera, et cetera. So we have the 2 hours a week for 8 weeks, and then it really slows down. So we have half an hour a week to monitor that feedback. So if you want to turn to page 3.
Right, and this is what we were just getting at, and per Commissioner Yao's suggestion, I think we should add something about our expectations in working with the communications.
Before you go too far, Commissioner Antai and I had a discussion, not a discussion, had a brief conversation. The hourly rates, I see the average rate when I look through your previous proposal, not obviously not this one, is much higher than what I had expected, okay, in term of the averages. I'm not questioning any particular one. What can you comment as to how these rates were established, and what contracts have you had that with the state that are using these rates?
We're just using our 2011-2012 rate sheet that the organization formalizes or decides each year. We can name some examples of different contracts. We have a contract with the Department of Water Resources. We have a contract with different contracts with Department of Mental Health, City of Fresno.
Yeah, those are good examples, but we have many, and they're all the same. They're standard
Just
rates.
the standard rates.
Have you submitted to the state any backup in terms of what you incur is actually what you're bidding?
Sure, we could. I'm sure we have some sort of backing out of the rate that we could provide. We don't have that today. I'm sorry, but we can ask our contracts. Or I mean,
contractors
we have
again.
that justification.
Okay, I guess the question is
contractor
to the commission is who is responsible for the rates? Are you the group that's determining whether these rates are acceptable,
Part of this
negotiate the
organic
rates, or
process
what?
is we kind of look to the finance committee, and then we look to Dan, and now we're scratching our heads. Who's responsible for that? I'm not sure who should be addressing that. Certainly, this group, this subcommittee, can address that, but that's.
But
I don't
aren't the
know.
rates, if they're they're a state agency, it's been established, it's gone through a vetting process. In the sense that there's accountability, this is not a private company, it's been established as a public institution.
Well, I'm sure the rate by itself has been audited, but are they using the right rate for the task that's being bid? Okay.
Oh, that's a different question, yeah.
Well, to me, when you assign a dollar rate to a particular task, to me, it's the same question. I don't know why you consider that to be a different question.
We wanted to know. I thought the question was: are these our regular rates that we use in other contracts, which they are? But we can explain the reason that you see it's usually 120 or 168, and that's literally Sarah or me. And so
Yeah, but if I add up all the 120, 168, and over the period of time that you're performing, do you have those hours?
No, and that's the thing is we had to write this under the time that we were preparing this. We had to just sort of assume it would be either us or someone at our level. There are a couple of places we knew it would definitely not be that way, and we've got much lower rates for that.
Like, for example, on page 6, setting up AV, we have that at a lower public outreach coordinator rate. So you do see some different rates. But so for the purposes, and we could get into it, but our idea is that we're given the number of meetings, we need to set up 4 teams of staff to go out and staff all the different workshops and hearings. And so what we're doing is we're modeling a team with a more senior person who's at the higher rate, such as myself, someone we label a senior mediator, and then somebody who is at an associate or assistant level. So just, for example, there could be someone whose rate is 130 an hour, and there could be someone whose rate is 110 an hour. But for the purposes of trying to keep it a little bit simplified for you, we are then saying 120.
Yeah, I'm not looking for an answer here. I'm really looking at the commission as saying that if we're going to approve this contract or this proposal, who is going to be looking at the rates? Okay.
Well,
maybe bring that up tomorrow when we have the.
Yeah, we could do that. But I'm assuming that when Dan had shaped this contract with you, he had raised that question as to how $120 an hour was arrived at. And I'm assuming he has some benchmark notion as to where that standard is. So I'm going to assume he's not here. I don't know what happened to him.
Yeah, the finance committee would be happy to take it over, but I would perhaps request that you get the 2 teams, the Northern California team and the Southern California team, and give me their what they're being paid and the overhead added to it, and then you'll give us an assessment as to whether it's reasonable or not. Okay.
Yeah, we can do that.
Sure, we can do that.
Okay. Do you want to continue on your deliverables?
Go ahead.
Right, so number 2, which is on page 3, the communication and outreach, these 3 tasks are, the task 1 is create network database, create initial contract. So this is, the first task, is I had to get my head back in it, is like the overarching, we need to create a database to fill in. We need to create talking points or initial emails that would be sent out. So when people are making calls to groups, we'd all need to be on the same message. So that's just sort of the upfront putting together the materials for us to go out and build this database. Task 2 would be, we're estimating about 24 hours per workshop, in parentheses, region. So so it's been hard because we've had a couple different proposals about ways to break the state into regions. So we're just operating off of the assumption that, say you're having one in Sacramento, we would just sort of have to break the state into our own regions for this purpose and do some outreach and build the database from that. And then so that would be an initial real push. That would be where all that work would happen up front so that we have the listserv, the database ready to go for any other updates throughout the process. And then we're doing a budget of 6 hours per region to upkeep. So when new people join in, we can input that and keep that going. So that's what the 3 deliverables are under.
All right. Anything else?
Okay.
All right. Well, that's your best judgment. So, I mean, you've been doing this for years, so we have to assume you know what you're doing, and it is your best judgment.
And we have spent countless hours talking it through and tearing it apart and building it back up and questioning ourselves and looking at our assumptions, so we would have a very solid number for you.
Good.
And what's realistic with the time that we have and things like that. So.
Yeah, because you have a real short time frame. Okay, page 4. We now have the toolkit piece. So the bottom half of page 4, task 1, So just again, the idea with your toolkit, you see at the top of page 4, some bullets around the general information that needs to be included in the toolkit. We know we want to leverage existing materials when possible, and we know we need to make the toolkit accessible. One of the things, ideally, we'd love to get your feedback on today, so we could do some work a little further on corresponding budget numbers, is we've been talking about 9 to 12 languages having the materials translated into, or you could do less. It's up to you, but we don't have any number to go with as far as how many languages you want your materials translated into.
Didn't the Budget Committee have something to say about that today?
My question,
I don't think we specifically addressed the translating. I know the translation remain in the budget that we're going to justify the fact that we need an additional and $2 million. But as far as the discussion is concerned, I don't think we spent any time talking about it. Was I right?
My question is, couldn't we just check with the Secretary of State as to what's required for elections?
Oh, I see.
And use that as a criteria?
Yeah, I thought that the line item specified funding for 2 translators at each session.
But we're
as I
talking
recall.
about two different things. One is translating documents, and the different is having interpretation at a meeting. So they're 2 different columns. So if I, speak Korean, and I'm coming to your public input hearing, are you going to have materials in Korean for me? Now, whether or not you have a translator real time is like a different question.
Commissioner Raya.
Did you determine the 9 to 12 based on experience you had with the census or some other project?
I went through all the populations that the census breaks out from before and did the top 12, and then I asked around, like, what do you need to do? And the thing that makes it, I think, a little tricky is it depends on the area you're in. There's a certain part of the, say, Central Valley where you might have one language that realistically no one else, you would hardly have anybody probably come get it, but because you have a density of a given community, like for, say, in the Sacramento region, people have told me you absolutely have to have Russian. You cannot do a public hearing in Sacramento without Russian. That's been advice that I've gotten from people I've talked to. But it's really going to be up to the commission. In other places, how much will the Russian documents be used? I can't say right now, but at some point you have to decide how many languages you want things translated into, because we have to make plans, because we need a week and a half from now to start getting things translated.
But you raise a good point. Certain areas, for example, are predominantly Hmong.
Exactly.
They're found nowhere else in the state. So if you're going to really communicate to them in some written form, you have to have that language.
Another good local example is Vietnamese in Orange County, Westminster, and we could go on with these countless regional examples. But
Can I ask a point of clarification in terms of in terms of the expense? It seems like when we're talking about translation of materials, there's 2 elements. One is the actual first round translation, which we could then, and then there's also the actual printing costs of things. Could you give us an idea of what the cost is to do the initial translation? I'm thinking in terms of having material on the web. If we don't actually have to physically print it and incur that cost, but what's the difference between the actual initial translation as well as the costs that are associated with the further, like hard copies, if we had to give those out?
Right. Okay, so I have guesstimate numbers for you because you don't have a toolkit yet. Therefore, I can't know exactly the number of pages you'd have translated. But what you're looking at for language, Spanish is much less expensive to have translated than other languages like, say, Vietnamese or Korean. So what I did for the purposes of looking at the average between both is I did an estimate of 27 cents a word. And so then if we assume, basically what you're looking at, I think per language is something between $1,000 and maybe $1,700, depending on how dense with text your handouts are. To do a whole set of that's just to translate, no printing, assuming you're translating your toolkit. With all the elements that you see at the top half of page 4. So now, as far as printing, estimates that we have on printing, you can do things for as cheap as 3 cents a page. I'm sure we have in our other direct costs the printing on here. We don't have the printing on here.
Not on there, no.
Not on this. Well, you can do a sort of a simple math of if you assume, say, 10 pages double-sided, that's 20 pages times 0.3, and then you want to, multiply that. I think the thing that I'm worried about, because it's the bigger cost, is the transactional time for the Center for Collaborative Policy, working with the translator to make sure they have what they need. How are the documents coming? Are they on time? Are there any glitches? And the thing I think you're honestly facing because of your tight timeline, I think it's very likely you will have a draft 1 of your materials because it's happening so fast, and then you're going to need to probably revise your materials. Things might change. So the transactional cost in here is higher than you saw at Claremont, because I think you're going to have to revise your documents, and then you have to do the whole process again.
So what are you looking at? I'm looking at $2,400, and you're saying how much more than that?
Well, but you have to understand that what you're looking at is the CCP time.
Yeah.
So what we've talked with Mr. Claypool about is that the Commission needs to contract directly with a translation service, because my estimate is you could easily be looking at $100,000 in translation and interpretation. Once you start to do the math times 30 and 2 translators and 750 and all these materials, it adds up very quickly. So it's not something that we could even possibly do a subcontract in our contract with.
That's a large ticket item, but language is such an intimate connection to culture. It is a direct connection to culture, and if one group sees it in their language, they feel immediately attached to it, and that's an important piece. But it's an expensive one. It's a tough call to make.
Commissioner Antai, maybe one of the things we could do is reach out to the various communities that have been asking us about getting involved. And if they represent a culture that has a different language, we could ask them to do the translation.
That could be a great idea. Things to think about with that idea are the transactional cost for your consultant in working with them, their turnaround time, how much you can count on them, and then depending on what kind of group they are, some other people might perceive or not feel confident about the translation job that they did. It can happen. And then if people are upset about the translation or what they perceive as a mistranslation, you have a transactional cost in dealing with those communities. I'm just being honest, you know.
So you suggest
Having created the first Spanish language census questionnaire, I understand the problem. But at some point, we have to, face reality too, and this could go on forever. And that's why I think we ought to find out what does the current law say about voting. That would be a good indication of what's absolutely required. And then, if even if you got a regular translator, and I can tell you this, somebody's going to argue with what that translator did. So if we went to a community of interest in that particular culture, at the very minimum, we could say, look, we went to a group of people who represent this point of view, and if they did a bad job from your perspective, you've got to go talk to them.
I can tell you that 3-day meeting in Claremont, we tried to solve just 2 translations, a sign language translation and a Spanish language translation. We couldn't make it work because then there are people out there that are capable of doing the work, but they're not going to be on a standby basis just in case you need them, okay? And then unless you pay them a retainer of some kind so that they'll be there. And then there's this issue of qualification. Who's going to be the judge as to whether they are qualified or not qualified? They tell you they can do the translation, but what does that mean? And and the liability associated with it, we couldn't solve that too simple problem. It's not that we can't identify sign language translator or Spanish language translator, but there are some issues there that unless you have somebody working on it full-time, we couldn't resolve it.
Commissioner Parvati?
I'd like to go back to Commissioner Baraba's suggestion that we at least invite local or regional speakers of whatever language to do their best effort to interpret or translate what's being said at these hearings, workshops or hearings. As long as we have a transcription, we're paying a lot of money to have these hearings, our meetings recorded and documented. We can always go back to that as a record to clarify if we need to, if any discrepancies occur with the translation process. So,
And could we add on to that maybe the language departments at some of the local universities and colleges to volunteer their time?
I think all those are great ideas. I have one specific thing, which is right now your first hearing is in Sacramento, March 12th. We haven't started your toolkit in any way. Nothing has been created. It has to be created. Your legal counsel and your communications director need to review it all, and then it needs hypothetically get translated. So a specific question I have is, for Sacramento, the recommendation I received is to do 3 languages, if you're trying to keep it simple for the moment, which is Spanish, Vietnamese, and Russian for Sacramento region. That's the recommendation I've gotten. So I think something for you, I don't know if it is realistic to find, with all the work we have to do in the next 2 weeks for that hearing, to find volunteers, to tell them they'll have a 2-day turnaround time from when they get it, and then will they have it back so we could get it to the printer on time. I just don't want to set us up for failure. And we could also just not translate anything for the first workshop, but we just need direction from you on what you want to do.
I think the 4 main language groups in California are Mandarin, Espanol, Spanish, English, and Tagalog. Those are the 4. And so I'm not sure whether those are the ones that legally the Secretary of State provides translated materials for in terms of elections and voting. The other point that I have is in the budget meeting this morning, under contracts, there is a line item for translation contingency, all meetings, and we talked this morning about having 2 translators per meeting, per day, two per day, and then there's about $58,000 there.
Actually, if I could, we talked about the number was generated by 2 per meeting so that I could have a number. I think there will be some places, clearly, where we may have meetings where there is no necessity for a translator, in which case, if we went to another venue where there was a necessity for 4 translators, but yeah, so that's how I came up with the number.
The question is that we've been talking about is, how do we know what the need is going to be at a particular location so we can contract with translators that are qualified to be there? And unless we put somebody on a retainer, then it's going to be tough to coordinate that, to
Can I
deliver.
get clarification? Maybe are you talking about translators? I thought we were talking about, there's the issue of translators at the meetings, then there's my understanding is what CCP needs direction for is to do the translations for the materials.
Printed material.
Printed materials.
Definitely, both issues are on the table, but right now, it's the
Printed material.
And then live, the way we distinguish it is translation of written materials, and then it's interpretation and like live, just semantics. But.
So you do not have that piece in your current
That's
proposal.
correct.
So it's up to the commission to make that call,
Exactly,
either
and
to
then we have-
provide that.
He has the line item. So the thing I just want you to think about for a second, if you're in our shoes, we want Sacramento first workshop to be a big hit, huge turnout. We're working with Mr. Wilcox. We're reaching out to everyone in the Russian community, for example. We're looking for every small Russian paper, Russian radio, Russian listserv, et cetera, et cetera. I really encourage all these people to come. Now, what Mr. Claypool just said is we could hypothetically have a spoken interpreter there so that when someone's speaking in English, they're interpreting into Russian for them. But unless you decide to have the materials, I won't have any handouts for them in their language. And we've, really pumped them up to come. And then they're going to go home without any materials to have as reference, at least for this first workshop.
I guess one of the
Commissioner Pervener, then Commissioner Barabo.
May I offer a quick fix suggestion? Okay, a no-cost suggestion in terms of the printed material, not the language or the spoken word aspect or component. There's a program produced by Alta Vista called Babelfish, and you can take the English text, push a button, and it gives you a variety of different languages, up to maybe 20, 30 different languages. Now, someone may have to go over it and scrutinize it and make sure that the interpretation is what you want it to be, because all languages have these nuances. So some local person that speaks that language may want to volunteer, so we may need a volunteer. But it's a quick fix solution for the printed upfront material that we might want to put out in terms of PSAs, announcements, that type of thing. That's no cost, really. There's some remarkable software programs and websites out today. Let's utilize them.
Are you familiar with that?
No.
I am.
You are.
I contact people all over the world, so I translate my material in different languages all the time. And I use it extensively.
Yeah, it helped me with some homework assignments.
So does he have a point?
He does. I would think it should still be reviewed by someone else just to make sure, which would still have some transactional costs, of course, associated with that. I'm not sure if a review is cheaper than an initial translation.
Perhaps a language instructor at Sacramento State would volunteer his or her time.
We'll look into that. Commissioner Barabo.
No, you go for the
the other issue you have is just because there's a large conurbation of a particular ethnic group, we really need to know whether they speak only their language. I mean, it may be that the people here with the Russian background also speak English. And there should, and I think on either out of the American Community Survey, I think you could probably get an indication of whether more than one language is spoken in that ethnic group. And because, if we're talking like 2 or 3 or 5% of that group that only speaks Russian, that's a big expense for us to reach out to 5% of a population group, which is probably not likely. And I know the other thing I ran into is if in many groups, if they couldn't read English, there was also a pretty good chance they couldn't read their own language. And so I'm sensitive to the need to reach out, but I don't think we ought to do it at any expense.
How do you respond to that?
I'm scared because we have a limited, you have a lot to do, and then we have a limited number of hours. So I love the idea of, we always want to leverage any way to do low cost or in kind, but for me it's so unknown how much time I would need to spend finding somebody, working with them, following up with them, and all those, I just can't help but wonder what point do those transactional costs possibly add up to the same cost it would have been to have someone just translate it once and us to have the confidence that it was done by a certified person, and if someone questions who did it, then we could refer back that it was a certified person. But I totally understand where you're coming from. We are very sensitive to the budget constraints. It is very expensive, there's no question. I also think I'm thinking kind of two minds. One is what's happening March 12th, and then say what's happening in April. Say for April, you're going to be in an area where there's a large Hmong community. Well, we'd have plenty of time, if it's in April, to look for someone to volunteer to help for that. I think what I'm the most nervous about is you really want your first couple events to be successful, really well received, and I think it would be really nice if there are folks there who aren't, that English isn't their first language, and that they're really a part of the process. I think everyone would probably feel good about that.
Okay, well, let's try to get our hands wrapped around this. So, Mr. Claypool, how would we go about getting a cost to hiring somebody that could help in these language translations? Do you have any feel for it?
Well, the first thing I would do is lean on our CCP experts to find out who's doing the work for them.
Right. So I have an estimate cost of $1,500 per language to get your whole set of your toolkit translated. You know, another thing we could possibly do is not translate everything, maybe translate, say, your three most key pieces of information, and then that could cut down on the cost significantly.
Okay.
Could you also, but going back to Commissioner Barava's point, you've mentioned all this outreach that you've done, like let's say the Russian community, and we're anticipating maybe a high turnout. Could you go back to those same contacts and say, tell us what do you think the need is for us to have translated material? Would it be enough if we maybe just had a translator there? Are we going to disenfranchise people if they show up and there's not? I mean, I think it's up to the same community leaders to tell us what we need, because I think that, as Commissioner Barava mentioned, there may not be a need, really. It would be nice, and it would be a consideration, and I think people can be connected, but if it's not something we need, we really have to be conscientious about our allocation.
Can you do a little field work and find out?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the way to go. When, you know, these meetings are over and then you're talking about budget things with Mr. Claypool, I think what makes me nervous is you have March 12th is so soon, and you only meet every 2 weeks. So unless you have maybe some kind of contingency, if, say you talk to 6 community leaders and they're like, yes, you definitely really need those, then if we don't have the go-ahead to do that, then our hands are tied. Do you follow me? And if they say it's not necessary, then no problem, we don't go forward with it.
Well, let's try that model for at least this first event. You guys go out and do a little field work and then report back to Dan and tell him, well, we only actually need one. They all they're bilingual, they speak English and Russian. But we won't know that until you do a little investigation. And then we'll know what to do after that.
Is Friday the day you're reporting out? Is that the day?
We don't know. we thought it was Friday.
I didn't know if maybe phone calls could be made by Friday to have some idea for the full commission.
I think this is one we could leave up to the executive director to speak on our behalf.
I would agree with that.
That's good.
Totally agree with that.
So, and I was over at the legal committee because there was something that needed to be answered there. But I have a question. So we have already discussed clearly, and I heard Sarah talking to community leaders about what they might need. But did we discuss the like the 4 or 5 day ahead of time, if you know you're going to need these services, call option, which is what the Bureau of State Audits did for all of the meetings that we had, and it was basically we're going to have this meeting, but it's incumbent upon you to help us make sure that we can put these resources in place for you. And so you should call us. I can tell you I don't believe anyone ever called. But I do believe in this particular case there will be areas where people will make that phone call. But I'm hesitant to put into place a system where we automatically assume at this great expense that there will be somebody there, and then to get there and find out that our translator's not translating.
But we're also talking about printed materials, and that can't be done in 5 days. So we're still left with the question of deciding what to do about printed materials well in advance. Well, more than 5 days in advance.
Yes.
So how much time do you need in advance if it's printed material that you need? Say in your survey you made some calls. Yeah, we do need some translation in a printed form. How much time do we need?
I've been told ideally if you don't want to pay a rush fee, you would like to give 5 to 7 days to give the documents
1
to be
week.
translated.
1 week.
And printed?
Translate.
No, that doesn't count printing. Assuming, then you need to add in, say, a day or two to print. But just to get it back from the company that does it.
2 weeks, would that do it? 2 weeks.
That'd be nice.
Well, could I suggest that perhaps because Spanish is such a large language group in California, that we move forward with Spanish for sure, and maybe look at the Russian question, by calling your partners to inquire about that.
Yes, I agree.
You had a third language for
Vietnamese was the other suggestion.
Okay.
But we could see if some people at the office tomorrow could make some calls and do some research.
Please. Commissioner Yao.
Commissioner, go ahead.
I apologize. May I suggest also that we check with the Secretary of State, who's required to translate in those languages, and we'll then have sources for making those translations.
Excellent,
So we can check with Dora.
excellent. Commissioner Young.
Commissioner Antai, you sat through the budgeting meeting at noontime. You know that we're going to try to get the extra $1 million and then get another extra couple $1 million. And that decision isn't going to be made for probably a long time. And if we were to live under the $3.5 million budget, this translation issue probably won't fit into that $3.5 million budget. And if we wait until we hear about the extra $2.5 million, I think most of our activity would have been over. So under that circumstances, I think even under the best scenario, we're not going to be able to have an opportunity to keep this item in the current budget. So I don't know whether we want to continue investigating it under that scenario as compared to facing the reality, saying that it's something that unfortunately we don't have the resources to deal with it at this point in time, and then go on.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we have to look at the overall fiscal responsibility that we commit ourselves towards these activities. But March 12th is not going to break us. Does that make sense? We're only doing this for March 12th, but we're going to learn a lot from it.
So I want to be sure I understand. We're definitely doing Spanish for March 12th, maybe Vietnamese, maybe Russian, and we're still only talking written materials, but we would agree to the 5-day notice for people to let us know if they actually need interpreters at the session?
My understanding on the 5-day that was that if we set up that expectation, we may not be able to deliver. So given that we would not go that route. Is that?
I think you need to take into consideration that what happens in the input meeting, once you have all these workshop material in all these languages, are you committed to saying that I'm going to provide somebody that can receive those inputs if they learn what they were taught and come back and want to give you testimony? Are you going to be able to say, I'm sorry, I don't have the ability to receive your input, and then walk away with it at that point in time? In other words, the budget, I think, is driving a lot of things that we can possibly do, and I don't see any scenario because of the timeline, not so much with the absolute dollars, that we can really take the first step without taking into consideration the subsequent actions that we're required to take.
See, this,
Commissioner Arroyo.
thank you. This is the argument I keep having in my own head, sort of a dilemma about this issue. And I think especially those of us who are from communities where another language is very important. But I'm looking at a lot of the people who are from another language community, and a lot of them are represented by someone, an organization or something. That's why I keep saying, are we really reaching out to individuals where this kind of service is going to be essential, or are we going to be hearing from someone speaking English, representing that community of interest? That's a dilemma I have, because yes, of course, in a perfect world we would have interpreters for everyone, but I don't know, the money is pretty scary. The cost is scary.
Again, we are only looking at March 12th. This is a trial balloon. I don't think we should say, okay, if we do it on March 12th, we've got to do it forever for every event we had. March 12th, I see as a trial period for us to test these models out. We're not committed beyond that. I think we would be wholly condemned if we don't try it.
But you do have to realize, too, that I think going back to Sarah's point, that the next meeting is just a week later, and if anything, we learn something on that meeting and say, well, we need to have that's a short time frame for them to change things. So I think you're right in terms of there's only so much we can do for March 12th, but we have to keep in the back of our mind that, not to set ourselves up for something grand that we can't accomplish in a week, or to be realistic that it might not be anything more than what we do.
Sure.
And we can't, I don't think we can assume either that what happens in Sacramento is a template for what's going to happen somewhere else. So I think we still haven't answered our question. Even waiting for doing the best we can March 12th still leaves a lot of unanswered questions for subsequent meetings.
May I ask a question? Is this, the things that we're translating, and we're still back to the print, this isn't specific to Sacramento, is it? Is it, so it's something that will play across the state no matter where we take it?
Exactly.
Maybe the solution in this is, we know at some point we're going to have Spanish translation. I mean, that's, I don't think anybody here believes differently. Maybe the solution on the 12th is to have the Spanish translation, but wait and see whether anybody else comes and says, where's this other translation? If that occurs, we can think about the volume of that. We can think about whether we need to reconsider this conversation. I'm just, I know that Sacramento is not the prototype of all of California, but I think you'll get a sense of how many people arrive and how many of them need these services. I really think that even for the translation services, we should be in a situation where, unless we know we're going into an area where someone tells us ahead of time, you're going to need this translation, that we should wait to see what we need rather than try to have something available that may not be needed. It's just a thought.
Yes.
I was just going to say, Commissioner Antai, I think it was your idea earlier. I think it is a good idea, if you're still interested, for tomorrow, I have a person in mind at our office who can make a few phone calls, do some investigation with these two specific languages that have been recommended to have it in Sacramento, and we can find out. Then the other thing we can do is we could look at our list. I mean, you might even just want to have one sheet that just has the very basics. What is redistricting? Who is the Citizens Redistricting Commission? What are some of the target dates that you have to abide by? You could have something very simple that therefore your average of 27 or 28 cents a word doesn't cost that much to be translated. There's a lot of different options. It's just, this is the first time we've ever talked about any of it. So I think it is a lot to figure out, and the money is a really important factor.
Yeah, and I think we're prematurely having a discussion to cut off language necessity everywhere, and I hope that's not what we're thinking. For example, if we were to publish this schedule only in English and not in other languages, I think that would be a great disservice.
And remember, part of the model that we're doing for the workshop is that a community organizer may come who is bilingual, but it might be nice to have those written materials in Spanish so they can go out to their community on their own and collect information and hand that out. So it's getting one past the person that might actually come to the meeting, which would really go with the translation material.
I suggest something based on what Commissioner Parvenu had said. Is it possible at some point that we could have these materials electronically posted, and an individual or a group could take them and try the computer program you mentioned, and they could, to some degree, they could just translate themselves and bring it to their community, and they may have the ability within their own community to do that, and that would be no cost for us.
Yeah.
And may I add, too, we can even do a trial. For example, the sheet that you mentioned, the information fact sheet, I'll call it that for lack of a better, a demo, and just place it in that software program, and I'll, for the record, repeat it. Alta Vista, it's a website actually, ALTA, VISTA, and the specific title is called Babel Fish, BABEL FISH. Any one of us can do this online. Do a trial fact sheet and have our Spanish-speaking commissioners, for example, take a look at it. Commissioner Aguirre here, Commissioner Ryan, say, oh, this is right on target. This is exactly what we mean to say. And it's a matter of simply pushing a button. And it's free and easy. and fun. So let's consider that no-cost option and experiment with it. We can do that this evening at home on our own computers if we have a link to internet, wireless, and that will save us a lot of trouble and time. Just a suggestion.
Do you have enough direction then to go?
Yeah, I feel like on Friday we can come back with some kind of new proposal.
All right, make that call.
Okay, great.
Okay, anything else in your?
Well, back to page 5 with the educational workshops. I'm just hitting this really quick because we already went through the model. But on the bottom of page 5 and all of page 6, you see budget numbers. So the first piece has to do with prepping up the workshop model. And then you have your per workshop costs, which you see at the bottom of page 6. You know, if you want, we could get into the assumptions, but those are your main numbers. And then on page 8, Charlotte already talked a little bit about the conference call and webinars.
Mm-hmm. And then in the graph here, you see, because it would be on the phone and not in person, it would be shorter, and you couldn't do that same interaction, so you'd have to cut some of the things out. So this is our attempt to adapt the model to a conference call format. So it'd be 2 hours total. And then on the next page, we have the deliverables and budget. The next thing, which is beginning on page 9, which we spoke about on Friday with our 2 commissioners, is the idea of an educational video. And I think in previous presentations we had talked about videotaping one workshop and making that available in some format, and we've sort of refined that idea. So we would we would videotape, not we, but we would have somebody videotape a workshop to get one time, and then we'd work with them to edit it down into what we're calling 4 modules, which would be like 10 minutes standalone sections. So, and I had some, just for example, the commission's process. So you could have a 10-minute, 7 to 10 minute thing that you take from the workshop. The actual, you wouldn't have to have it recreated, but it would just be a standalone. So if someone was, all they were interested in was mapping tools or demos, you could take the 10-minute module just from the workshop that talked about that. And so this is all of that detail there. And then our estimates for CCP's deliverables, our actual hours in putting that together. And then Sarah worked to actually get an estimate from an outside vendor on what it would take to edit, take the raw content, and put all that together.
So that would be a professional piece, video piece, and we can share that with all our partners as well.
Exactly. The idea is you could have it online, you can have it on DVDs, it would accompany the toolkit. So if I go to an educational workshop and then I want to come back and do a house event with my PTA, I can show the video, I'll have the toolkit materials. Mm-hmm. So you see down here at the bottom of page 9, it's the same figure we had as an estimate last time, which is to create that video, the 4 10-minute modules, which includes the filming, creating a script so you have a plan of, you get what you need, the motion graphics and all the post-production, that's $8,000. And then if you go to page 10, we talked last Friday about the idea of a 1 to 2 minute trailer. It's something you could have on your website or put on Facebook or things like that. That gives people a quick 1 to 2 minute introduction to who the commission is and what you do, what you're going to do. That's listed there for $2,500. And then task 3, we have this separated out because it's another, expensive. Well, some people might perceive it as inexpensive. Some might perceive it as expensive. I shouldn't say that. But to translate your 4 modules into a different language. So if you are translating it into Tagalog, for example, what we're talking about is the script gets translated to Tagalog. Then a Tagalog speaker is in the recording booth, records it all. It gets dubbed in over your the person speaking the English, and then when, say, you're talking about a given handout from the toolkit, if in the original video it shows the English piece of paper, it would instead show assuming you're translating, it would show the Tagalog translated piece of paper, so that if somebody is looking at home, they can marry the written documents with what is being talked about. And so for that, you're looking at $2,200 per language.
Commissioner Antai?
Yes, Commissioner
I
Baraba.
think this last idea is really a good one in the sense that it addresses the issue that Commissioner Yao just mentioned, is that if we run out of money, this is one way of really getting the message out inexpensively. And so I would think that an investment in this is because if we can't go to all these meetings, we could say, hey, we don't have the money, but if you want a CD, here it is. You know, and so I think this is a really good investment.
Send it to every public library, to all of our partners, to every foundation, to everybody who's interested in what we're doing, but we can't get there.
Could I just...
And downloadable, too.
What?
And downloadable, too.
Right, and it's all just to keep in mind how it all is building together. They're all being built upon this toolkit, so the materials are always the same. It's the same type of format as the educational workshop, just broken out. So it's all complementing each other.
And at the least, in the language, we can say aloha, talofa, ni hao ma. You know, we can say that to make that sensitivity.
You can say cubo.
I just was curious. It's my understanding with a lot of this, we're still talking about just the educational workshop component.
That's correct.
I'd be curious to see, I don't know if you've gone forward in looking at the input hearings, because I'd like to think that some of this could be duplicated, so we don't have to come back in another couple weeks and say, oh, here's what we plan to do for the input hearings, especially if we're doing, as Commissioner Bravo said, something like these videos, not only to have the educational aspect, but to make sure the input side is included as well. I don't want to, it'd be great to see that you could merge the educational and input material as much as possible. I know this was specifically about the educational, but I think that would be helpful to, again, leverage the interactions of the type of outreach we're doing.
Well, let me ask a question of clarification, because I want to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So the idea with the video, for example, is maybe your introductory component with your basic information about the commission. One thing we've been talking about is at your pre-education hearings, at your input hearings where you have your pre-education segment, you could have a television, kind of like at a museum, playing your 7 to 10 minute introductory piece over and over, so that as people come in at 8 or 9:30 or whatever before your hearing, they can see what you have to say. Now, so your materials from the toolkit take you throughout the whole process as far as the content, and so the same would go of the video, but the piece that I think we all just want to be clear on is exactly the way your technical person is going to be rolling up and indexing your data. We don't know that yet, so if we're going to shoot the video possibly March 12th, because this video person is based in Sacramento, it makes it cheaper for you not to pay for any of his travel or to move all the equipment and the lights, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're going to do it March 12th, I just don't think you'd have that piece then.
I guess I was just suggesting that as we go forward, to keep that in mind, that it might be a piece just to tag on to that. It needs to be added.
Let's keep that.
That'd be great.
Let's keep that open. Anything else?
Commissioner?
Oh, Commissioner.
This is very interesting, and I see that Mr. Wilcox has just walked in right on cue as we're talking about outreach here, so I'm glad you're here to hear this. Its synthesis is so important with what we're doing, because I believe Mr. Wilcox has spoken about the video component. I'm certain that the video component was spoken about this morning in the Public Information Advisory Committee as well. We're speaking of it now so that we don't duplicate efforts or work out of sync. Certainly when we convene as a full commission, it's important for each of us to know exactly what we're doing to expedite the process, of course, as we're all aware of. So I'm very glad to see some discussion on this, but most importantly, I'm looking forward to the synthesis of this so we can produce something and put it out there ASAP. March 12th and beyond. So thank you for your participation as 1/3 of the leg of us working together to make this happen.
We have a lot to talk to you about.
We just want to say on the last page, page 15, we have a summary of each task and the cost, and then it's added up there.
All right.
And I think our final thing is simply, do you have any other feedback for us for what you would like us to share on Friday?
Okay, so let me ask
Or is it
Mr.
even on
Claypool,
Friday?
are we prepared to go forward on Friday to contract with CCP at this point?
Yes, I mean, if the commission approves a plan, then I would go ahead and start moving with putting in place the contract. So,
Okay. All right. So we have 15 minutes, actually 10 minutes left. So I want to introduce Bonnie Glazer, if you can come up. Bonnie is with the statewide database. And you've been sitting here listening to this discussion. Any comments on how we can fit in the technical piece in this workshop?
Perhaps we could have Bonnie introduce herself.
Bonnie Glazer at UC Berkeley. I actually don't work for the database. I work with the people at the database. I'm a research analyst. I'm sort of on loan from the Election Administration Research Center, where I mostly study poll worker training. But I am totally involved with our Irvine-funded grants for the last 2 years. For last year and this coming year. That's my main activity. I do think that we can work the technical piece into the workshop model. I don't know if you want specifics on that now, or if that's just a discussion that can take place another time.
Well, that's a very important statement right there. I'm very happy to hear you say that. So maybe at this point we can assume that we need to get back together with you and Dan and see how we can weave that through somehow with the educational workshops that we've just discussed this evening with CCP. So that's a very good thing to hear. Any other comments from the board?
There's, Bonnie, the outline for the workshops show about an hour and a half window for your organization to present the information, the technical aspect. So does that work for you? Secondly, how do the centers work into this schedule? Whether they're, we're going to be collaborating on that or not, or whether CCP and you are going to be collaborating on that piece also?
I'm not quite sure I understand your question about the centers. Are you asking if they'll be open by then, or?
Well, are they going to be open pretty soon? Or?
We're hoping for March 7th as the very last date that they'll all be open.
Okay.
So they should be open by March 12th.
So, because we're talking about the educational workshop component at this time, right? And we're reserving the input, the pre-mapping and post-mapping for later, given a selection through the RFP process. So, as far as the schedule for the educational workshops, then do you think can you fit into all of those days?
Can we be there for all of those days?
Yes.
As far as I know, we can. Yes.
And is there? I know that CCP is being tasked with developing materials that they are going to develop or help print that relate to the technical aspects of providing input, et cetera, et cetera. Do you have those already available, or are you providing information to them so that they can develop it? What about materials?
They're close to being ready.
Yeah. All right.
So it is going to be a little hard by March 12th, I have to say, but I think we could probably do it.
Okay. All right.
Commissioner Gary, could I get clarification in terms of, I guess I'm trying to get the players. I was sitting in on the finance meeting today, and from what Mr. Claypool said, was the original 20,000 that had been allocated for CCP to subcontract with Cairn was no longer able to be done, so they were going to look for a technical consultant. So now are we actually using statewide database as the technical consultant for the workshops? Because that was changed in the line item from the...
I'll ask Mr. Claypool to respond. What I would comment is that at our last meeting, we said that we could go forward with a contract with Q2.
Yeah, I thought that had changed. That was my only question. I thought
Well,
today's discussion it was changed, but that's why I was looking for clarification on.
Yes, and the way it changed today was that we had lined it out because it didn't appear as though there was going to be enough time to put a non-competitive bid contract into place for those services. At this point, I guess we'd have to go back and talk with Carol Umfleet and ask two questions. The first one I would direct to Bonnie. If we tried to get this through, would it be acceptable to do it contingent on the performance of all of the workshops and then a payment at the end?
I can't answer that question.
Sure.
I mean,
Okay, but I mean that's one way we can do it is if we have the time to get it in place and make it contingent on the completion. The only other way, because this is going through Q2.
right.
Okay, so interagency is not an option unless I don't know unless you could put it under Berkeley.
I don't think we can.
Okay, so that route is out. So after that, and we certainly don't have enough, as you know, enough time for competitive bid. There's one other possibility I have to take a look at, but at this point, I would say the only viable route that I can see is to have it all come due so that we can make it a long-term bid, and even that might be dicey.
So even though, as Commissioner Geary mentioned, at the last meeting we had approved the bid, the contract with Q2 for the technical
Right.
Consulting just for the education workshops, and then as of this morning, it was that was when you were doing the line item, it was taken out, but now we're back into consideration of that. So you'll give us an update on that.
Right, and the reason it goes in and out is because the last time we did it, we had a different vehicle for funding it, and I have to see now whether that possibility is still available to us. If it isn't, the only vehicle we have is a non-competitive bid. So I hesitate. I just have to ask some questions to find out what possibilities are available to us to get this done.
So to go back to Commissioner Antai's question, do we have anyone else that's able, if we cannot go this route, the need for technical consulting for the workshops, I would think is imperative. Is there any other options?
There are other options, but clearly, we've worked with Q2 for a long time. They've put together a very quality package, and we'd like to continue that relationship just to bring this one to closure, to bring it forward, because we talked to them, and I think part of their efforts on our behalf were made because they believed that they were going to participate in this process. But at this point, it's just the time is compressing so closely that I just have to find out what our options are before I can say any more.
Commissioner
You're
Antay.
going to report back to us.
Commissioner Antay, maybe I missed something, but I thought at the last meeting we agreed as a commission that we would have a non-competitive bid for just the outreach program. That was somehow turned off?
At the last meeting, it was actually what was actually discussed was folding this contract under CCP's contract, folding it in to be basically a contractor to them, and then they would ensure that they got paid, and that's how we could get around not having a non-competitive bid. I shouldn't say that was the vehicle we were talking about. But at this point, I just don't know whether that's still available to us or not. So if that didn't happen, the only other way we could do it would be with a competitive bid. Or non-competitive bid, I'm sorry.
Is the option of a non-competitive bid off the table? For just the educational, technical consultant for the educational workshops?
Is it off the table?
Is it like not a possibility? Is it just not realistic?
It's only realistic if we structure the contract so that all the payments, all the workshops occur, and then we make the payment. Yeah, that's the only way it can work. And I have to check with Carol Fleet and see if that's even possible. But that is one route to doing it. But we have a lot of things we'd have to put in place. Again, the original concept was to structure it underneath another contract and have them work as a subcontractor. But for the amount that we're talking about now, that may not be possible. And so then we have the other route. If that doesn't occur, then the only other thing I can think that's available to us for this slot is to get somebody who will do the technical work for under $5,000, because we can procure the services for on a personal services contract.
All right. Thank you, Bonnie.
What is the approximate value of this effort? Institute that.
Budget wasn't a light item, it was 20.
If you'll just give me a second.
While Mr. Claypool is doing that, we're going to be ending very shortly, and I do want to tell the public, who's our partner, that if there's anyone out there that'd like to make some comments before we close, I invite you to do so.
I think Claypool has a response.
Yeah. Mr. Claypool, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. I'm Trudy Schaefer with the League of Women Voters of California, and my question is partly addressed to you, as it is just that in the agenda that's been posted for tomorrow and Friday, I see that the very first item is Commission Governance Matters Detailed Agenda. I'm asking, I've heard all of you speak to the fact that you expect the report from your advisory committee to be on Friday, but the public does not know that. So I wanted to ascertain if that is correct and if you have anything more detailed about whether this is the order in which things will go and that's why we can assume Friday, or if you expect that the order will also be changed. And to the extent that's possibly issued before tomorrow morning, it would be great.
You know, part of the confusion, and I must admit it's a confusion, to the public, is that we design these agendas so that it gives us the greatest flexibility to jump from one basket to another. And it doesn't help the public to try to follow our process. So, not being the chair, I don't know which one of these baskets will show up tomorrow. So I really don't know how to answer that.
Well, I appreciate it, and I don't mean to sound as if I'm accusing you all of trying to hold back information. I'm very, very aware and have said this in many of the discussions among my partner organizations that I understand that your generic, if you will, agendas are for that reason, and I understand with the 14-day notice that you have to give for your meetings that has been necessary. But it, as you recognize, is making it very difficult for people to know when to watch or to come to hearings. And so, to the extent possible, I think you will be hearing more and more that we hope that you'll be able to make announcements at the beginning of a day, at least, if not at the beginning of the overall meeting. I've also hoped that as your meetings may get shorter and shorter, but that would take care of itself. But this turns out to be a meeting that disproved that expectation. So at any rate, I would appreciate whatever you can do, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Could we make a suggestion to Commissioner Galambos-Malloy, who is our chair, that she'll just make an announcement in terms of maybe a general framework that we'll try to do starting in the morning, so that way the public will have a general idea of what we're trying to do in the next 2 days?
I think that would be very helpful. Mr. Claypool.
The total cost for the participation would be $23,750.
Thank you.
Not bad, not bad. Okay, then if, oh, I'm sorry, come on up. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Ronnie Woods. I'm from the Los Angeles County Federation of Labor AFL-CIO. And I had the pleasure of attending your meetings over in Claremont and now here in Sacramento. And I just had a few thoughts for you. First off, it seems like 4-hour workshops might be a bit long. It's a bit long when the hearings are a bit long. So I'm just thinking that you might want to break them up, perhaps 2 sets of 2-hour hearing or 2-hour workshops. So maybe 2 hours from 5 to 7 and then from 7 to 9, because most folks are not going to get there right at 5 o'clock.
7 to 9.
Another thought also was for the conference calls. Those are supposed to be 2 hours, the conference calls, webinars. And I don't think it's realistic that people are going to stay on a webinar for 2 hours. And then last of all, for Los Angeles County, I know you're talking about, I believe it's March 19th for the educational workshop, and that's also the day of the LA Marathon. And I think that might be a concern because we're talking about, MAP over here was talking about access to public transit. We want to make sure as many people can get to the hearings as possible. So just keeping those things in mind.
Is that a big event?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
I've never seen
Mark
that.
the streets off.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you very
Get
much.
anywhere on Marathon Day.
Okay, if there aren't any more comments, I will close this subcommittee meeting. Thank you very much.